while Khan even had a baseball jacket made for her to read Superman, the comic book, in timing with the release of the upcoming Superman the movie. All this led to the DC explosion in 1978, which came with a price jump to 50 cents from 35 cents, along with a new lineup of books to compete with Marvel. To do this, DC reportedly instituted a warm body plan, according to writer Mike W. Barr, implying that if you were a warm body, you got a job at DC. Khan set about to fill these roles by poaching many of Marvel's talent, including Len Wein, Jerry Conway, Roy Thomas, Marv Wolfman, George Perez, and Russ Andrew. When Stan Lee was asked about this at a 1978 speaking engagement, he bluntly stated that Marvel would sell more books than ever, while DC's move would probably fall flat on its face. Lee would prove to be a prophet on top of a talented writer, editor, and marketer, as all of DC's work would implode within 3 months, turning the hyped DC explosion into the dreaded DC implosion, leading to half of the line being canceled. Of the 50 titles released by DC in the previous 3 years, only 6 would survive in 1978. Some had argued this was openly a good thing for DC, as it allowed the company to clear out some of the dead weight, while also being able to experiment with new formats, such as producing the first limited series with the 3-issue World of Krypton in 1979. Marvel benefited as well, as many of these out-of-work creators came back to them, which also included Jack Kirby, who had returned to Marvel back in 1975 when his DC contract expired. Plus, it was during this time that another Marvel franchise entered into popularity that would send Marvel into even greater heights: the X-Men. While initially popular in Stan Lee and Jack Kirby when it was first released back in 1963, the X-Men had fallen on hard times, was even being repainted for a significant portion of its run. With sales so low at the time, what would today be a very nice $100,000 an issue, the X-Men even faced cancellation, and it was then decided to give them a revamp. The artist for the job was Dave Cockrum, who was left DC for Marvel with a new character in tow. Cockrum originally considered putting him in the Legion of Superheroes comic for DC, but the editors thought the blue-skinned devil character would be too scary and weird for their comic. Marvel found him perfect for the X-Men, though, and soon Nightcrawler joined the ranks of the team alongside new members Colossus, Thunderbird, Storm, Banshee, Sunspot, Wolverine, and team leader Cyclops. The new team was truly international, with Colossus being from Russia to Wolverine being Canadian, while Cockrum's own Nightcrawler was German. The launch was Giant Size X-Men #1 in February of 1975 with writer Len Wein, which established a new team and set the comic on a path for dominating the market. It was followed up by the relaunch of Uncanny X-Men with issue number 94 on May of 1975 with art by Cockrum and writing by Chris Claremont. John Byrne would have replaced Dave Cockrum when he left the book in 1977 with issue number 108, and soon the duo of Claremont and Byrne would turn the Uncanny X-Men into one of the comic's premier books, with a legendary run that would include such classic storylines as Days of Future Past and the Dark Phoenix Saga. By June of 1979, Marvel had truly dominated the American comic book marketplace, with the closest DC book being a fantasy series Warlord at number 21 in sales. Plus, the company just got a new editor-in-chief in Jim Shooter, who would have a controversial but ultimately successful run in the role. However, his aggressive leadership style would run off many of Marvel's veterans, notably Roy Thomas, Gene Colan, and Marv Wolfman to DC. Shooter would joke that DC needed top-quality talent, so he understood why they poached from Marvel. Wolfman, in particular, would help revive the Teen Titans, a team book consisting of the sidekicks of the major superheroes such as Robin and Kid Flash, with George Perez, first in DC Comics Presents, number 26, which was inserted free of charge at considerable cost to DC, and then the new Teen Titans number 1 in August of 1980. The book was so good that many jokingly called it DC's first Marvel book, or DC's X-Men, as it started to rival that series' sales. This would be the start of a banner decade for DC, as for the first time since the emergence of Marvel, DC was starting to gain good press again. The new decade would also mark a renewal in the rivalry between Marvel and DC, fueled by Jim Shooter's leadership, along with the distancing of the company offices, which were now 30 blocks from one another instead of just being in walking distance. When DC raised its price from 40 to 50 cents, Marvel scoffed, saying they would never do that, only to do just that 2 months later, leading to DC to paper their offices with those previous quotes from Marvel. Even the friendly inter-company softball game became bitter, as Shooter, who played first base, started to suspect that DC was bringing in ringers to win the game, to the point that he questioned one DC player over his job, who could only reply, I'm in production. To continue on with this new decade in rivalry, DC penned a new ad, "There's no stopping us." But when some poor sale figures came out, Marvel jokingly added, "There's no stopping us, because they are going downhill." This friction continued between the companies, though some crossovers were launched. First with Superman and Spider-Man in July of 1981, then Batman vs. the Incredible Hulk in 1982, and finally the Uncanny X-Men and the New Teen Titans that same year. Originally, it was supposed to be the Legion of Superheroes, but it was replaced by the Titans due to its new popularity. Superman and Spider-Man was especially frustrating, with both Marvel and DC fighting over deadlines, even though the verses were replaced with "and" to signify a new cooperation. Finally, a plan was announced against the Justice League of America to meet the Avengers for 1982, with Jerry Conway and George Perez tasked with producing it. However, clashes over the story forced its cancellation, with Perez even leaving the project in frustration and stating he would refuse to ever work with Marvel again as long as Jim Shooter was there. DC would eventually return Perez's unused artwork from the project in 1994, which he promptly sold. The bitterness was so bad, both companies produced rival editorials to explain to fans why it failed, and it will be decades before the Justice League and the Avengers would ever finally meet. While Marvel dominated the comic book front, the one place DC continued to shine was in TV and film adaptations. Back in 1940, DC had a Superman balloon in the Macy's Day Parade, along with the classic Max Fleischer Superman cartoon from 1941 to 42. By 1943, Batman had his own movie serial, followed by Superman's in 1948. As for Marvel, their Captain America movie serial in 1944 was an embarrassment that had little to do with the character. He was a district attorney who donned a mask to fight crime, and it wouldn't be until 1974 that the Marvel character would appear in live action again, that being the Spider-Man segments on the PBS series The Electric Company. Then in the 1950s, the highly successful The Adventures of Superman TV show aired, followed by the 1960s by the campy but immensely popular Adam West Batman show, which earned DC $1,000 an episode plus 20% of the profits. Meanwhile, the best Marvel could do was the Marvel Superheroes cartoon in 1966, which was so poorly animated it featured panels swiped from the comic books, and then Ralph Bakhti's Amazing Spider-Man cartoon, a campy but flawed effort, though it did produce that catchy Spider-Man song, along with the now popular meme of two Spider-Mans pointing at one another. A lot of this had to do with Marvel not knowing how to license their characters or even their value. At one point, the rights were sold for $2,500 by Chip Goodman, Martin Goodman's son, and then 12 characters' rights were sold to Universal for $12,500 in 1976. The latter led to the infamous Spider-Man live-action TV show in 1977, which had little to do with the comic, but also the more finely received Incredible Hulk show that same year, which lasted for 5 seasons. DC wasn't sitting idly by, producing the popular Wonder Woman TV show in 1975 starring Linda Carter. All this would peak in 1978 when Superman the Movie, starring Christopher Reeves and directed by Richard Donner, was released that December, setting box office records and critical acclaim. Even Superman's creators, Joel Siegel and Joe Shuster, tearfully thanked director Richard Donner for doing the film right. The film was so good it made comic books reputable again, though it would be years before the rest of the industry followed up. Even DC took its time, with the B-movie Swamp Thing, directed by the late great horror master Wes Craven, being the next film in 1982. It didn't help that after the superlative Superman 2 in 1980, even that film franchise started to go downhill, with the failure of 1984's Supergirl movie, and then Superman 3 in 1983 and 4 in 1987. While Superman the Movie set a new standard in comic book films that is still considered the model to follow, both Sam Raimi and Patty Jenkins, the directors of Spider-Man and Wonder Woman respectively, cited as a chief inspiration for their films. It will be more than a decade before the rest of the industry truly caught on. It did establish that while DC was lagging in the comic books department, it still led in other mediums, at least for now. Back in the comic book front, the industry was changing with the invention of the direct market, which allowed the publishers to sell directly to retailers, leading to an explosion of comic book shops and specialty stores. In 1974, it accounted for $300,000 of Marvel's profits, but by 1979, it was $6 million. Another plus, that unlike the newsstand networks, the direct market had no return policy at the time, allowing Marvel and DC, along with other publishers, to be more daring in their products. With so much money coming in, Marvel hired Mike Friedrich in 1980 to handle their direct market, while DC followed in 1981 by hiring Paul Kuperberg. One of Friedrich's first tasks was to test how viable the direct market was with the release of the Dazzler in December of 1980, which was exclusive only to comic book stores due to the direct market. Despite being C-level character from the X-Men, it sold 428,000 copies. DC would follow suit with Madame Xanadu in April of 1981 at a then unheard-of price of $1, but it still sold 100,000 copies. By 1982, 50% of Marvel's sales was through the direct market and accounted for 70% of their profits. Direct market also gave a more direct line to fans, and the company started tailoring their books to their taste. DC produced Camelot 3000 in 1982, the first maxi series, a limited series that went over 6 issues, in Camelot's case 12, and then Omega Man in April of 1983. Marvel put out the Death of Captain Marvel book in 1982 for $5.95 and sold 200,000 copies. Fans also demanded higher quality paper and art, something that the creators wanted as well, which led to Ronin by Frank Miller in 1983 from DC. It was originally a concept that Miller was planning to use at Marvel, having already successfully revived Daredevil for the company, but DC president Jeanette Kahn managed to lure him away with one of the most lucrative contracts in comic history, along with a guarantee of quality printing and paper. Kahn also produced another innovation to recruit creators to DC as well, when she finally able to launch her royalty program, part of a long-standing promise to treat creators better, providing 2% sales revenue to writers for issues that sold over 100,000, 1.4% for artists, and 0.4% for inkers. The last was something that Dick Giorgiano, being an inker himself, pushed for. Marvel's editor-in-chief Jim Shooter claimed to have come up with the idea of royalties first, but the Marvel brass had shot him down. However, once DC put their plan into effect, Marvel, for the first time in decades, actually was following them. This would be a benefit for Marvel in the end, since Marvel books sold exceedingly more than DC, leading to higher royalties for the creators, and as a result, paid out $2 million in their first year once the program was instituted. Jeanette Kahn was famous for her recruiting techniques, even inviting creators to dinner parties at her apartment, where they would find cookies baked in the shape of their characters. For example, Walt Simonson had Thor cookies made for him. Strangely, all these efforts would seem to be for naught, as on February of 1984, Marvel was given a chance to license DC outright. Bill Sarnoff, the head of Warner Brothers, was tired of DC Comics continuing to lose money and thus approached Marvel to license and produce its comics. While DC lost money making comics directly, the licensing and the merchandise was lucrative, thus Sarnoff wanted to offload the comics to Marvel, who actually made money doing comics, while using them to promote their various TV, film, and merchandising licenses. It was a seemingly win-win for everyone. DC would unload a losing part of their company, while Marvel would gain a lucrative new assets, and also establishing ties with Warner Brothers for their own future licensing deals. The initial plan called for Marvel to publish 7 comics based on DC's core characters: Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Justice League, Teen Titans, and Legion of Superheroes. Jim Shooter loved the idea, but decided to run the numbers just to be sure, only to learn that even a conservative estimate would net Marvel $3.5 million in its first 2 years. Ed Shulkin, Marvel's circulation head, argued it would be double that. Marvel would even receive a cut over any license Warner Brothers produced from the books as well, and could help Marvel finally develop their own licenses with the Marvel characters. Ultimately, it never went through due to outside factors, when First Comics, an indie publisher best known for Howard Chaykin's American Flag series, sued Marvel over anti-competitive practices, claiming it was flooding the markets with books to keep smaller publishers off the racks. Acquiring DC would not have helped Marvel's case, and thus it was dropped, leading many to endlessly wonder what would have happened if it had went through. And we will leave you there for now, but after DC dodges that bullet, they will come roaring back in the 1980s and truly challenging Marvel, and both will end up being reshaping the entire industry in the 1990s and beyond. And now is February 13th, 2020, time for the favorite comic of the week. Conan, Serpent War, number 1, by Jim Zub and Scott Eden, which finds 3 of Robert E. Howard's classic creations, Conan the Barbarian, Solomon Kane the Puritan, and Dark Agnes, teaming up with Marvel's Moon Knight in a strange adventure that connects all their timelines against an evil villain. Jim Zub does a really good job connecting all these characters, and it's always great to see more of Robert E. Howard's classic characters mixed in, because Marvel's done a great job mixing Conan into the larger Marvel universe, so it's great to see them, Kane and Dark Agnes, make their appearance as well. And Moon Knight's always fun to see wherever he shows up, while Scott Eden's art manages to capture each era perfectly and connects all the characters with a nice action-packed storyline, so very interested to see where the story goes. So, definitely check this out. And also, congratulations to DC Warner Brothers for their 2 Oscar wins over the last weekend. Joaquin Phoenix won for Best Actor in a Motion Picture playing the Joker, being the second actor to win an Oscar for the Joker. Naturally, of course, being the late, great Heath Ledger for his performance in The Dark Knight back in 2008. And also, the film won Best Musical Score as well.